Why does every movie seem to use a stupid amount of CGI today? And what happened to the golden age of practical effects? It feels like every movie I watch, there's behind the scenes footage of said film and it's just green screen on top of green screen, and I'm sick of it. And some movies even go too far with CGI to the point where it actually ruins the movie as a whole.
Take Jurassic Park, for instance. Everyone remembers it as the movie that invented CGI dinosaurs, which is technically true, but wildly misleading. Spielberg used computer-generated dinosaurs for approximately 4 minutes of the entire screen time. So yes, there were CGI dinosaurs, but everything else, the T-Rex attacking the Jeep, the raptors hunting in the kitchen, and the sick Triceratops throughout the whole film, was Stan Winston's team building full-scale animatronic dinosaurs. The T-Rex in the movie alone weighed 9,000 pounds and stretched about 40 feet from snout to tail. It took months to design and practically build and required a dozen of puppeteers operating hydraulics in real time. And this dinosaur was actually real because it literally kept malfunctioning during the rain scene because the latex skin absorbed water and made it move when it wasn't supposed to. They kept having to pause filming to wring out this giant web-like dinosaur because it was a practical effect. Now this obviously sounds like a nightmare, right? Expensive, time-consuming, and virtually unpredictable. So why did they bother? Because when actors screamed, they were screaming at a 40-foot robotic monster chasing them. Their fear was performative in some way as they are actors, but a giant animatronic dinosaur chasing after them would give that actual feeling of something that is really scary going to attack them. But the T-Rex breath that was fogging up the window wasn't some CGI rendering artifact. It was literally the breath fogging up from the hydraulics. The shot here happened because it was practical, not in spite of it. But from a basic film theory perspective, practical effects weren't just a technical choice. They were a limitation that actually forced creativity. Blade Runner is maybe the perfect example to show that a limitation can really force creativity in the best way. Ridley Scott needed to show a massive futuristic Los Angeles cityscape, but he didn't have CGI at the time and obviously couldn't afford to build a full-scale set life-size of Los Angeles. So his team built intricate miniatures of the same city, the pyramids, the flying spinner cars, and some of these miniatures were small enough that you could literally hold them in your hand. But they had fiber optic lighting and thousands of individual tiny wires operating the whole thing. The effects team shot nearly 90 special effects sequences, some requiring 35 to 40 layered elements photographed in a 65mm format, specifically Super Panavision 70. Now think about that. So many 65mm format photographs stacked over and over again to create this look. It wasn't a computer-generated software. It wasn't a video of a stock footage that was manipulated. It wasn't a 3D model that was built up from the ground up. No, it was literally taking real-world objects layered with other real-world objects stacked together to make a really realistic-looking cityscape. Also, we have to understand that Super Panavision 70 65mm format photos are insanely expensive, and yes, it would be cheaper to do it in CGI today, but I think it got way more recognition because of the work ethic it took to get there. VFX supervisor Douglas Trumbull chose this large format because it reduced grain buildup when stacking multiple elements together, and they used forced perspective. Matte paintings and their incredibly complex optical printing process, when they layer element after element with microscopic precision, it allowed for this amazing cityscape to be created with minimal grain for punching in, and allowed the actual actors to feel like they were in a real cityscape once it was all put together. But why go through these absurd lengths to make this tiny little cityscape? Because Ridley Scott understood something crucial for the movie. The medium shapes the message. He needed the world to feel lived in, texturized, tangible. If it looked clean or artificial, the whole noir atmosphere just virtually collapses. The miniatures with their handcrafted details and optical imperfections gave the world a history. Not everything was computerized and digitized, and everything looked imperfect, which is what made it perfect. You could actually believe that the people there existed because you knew how much craftsmanship went into the actual look. Without this sounding like a college lecture, there is a concept in film studies about visual honesty. It's the idea that audiences have almost a subconscious ability to detect when something feels true versus when it obviously feels fabricated. It's really similar to baking cookies, but instead of following the recipe word for word, you're following it from memory of when your nana used to make them, but versus now, you're having AI tell you exactly what to do to make the perfect cookie. But the cookie that was made by your nana from so long ago is going to have that feeling, that history, being able to tell the person what the recipe was versus, yeah, it was from a website. So if practical effects worked so well, why did the industry abandon them completely? The shift obviously wasn't overnight and it was very much gradual, but it did then happen suddenly where everything changed, and it was the late 90s. The late 90s marked the acceleration point for when Hollywood was really getting into making CGI and computer effects the norm. And 1999's The Phantom Menace became the poster child for that transition, even though the reality was more complicated than people really remember. George Lucas was the pioneer of practical effects in movies, from the original Star Wars trilogy with motion-controlled cameras, detailed miniatures, and revolutionary puppetry. It was obviously a great series. But by the late 90s, he did become obsessed with a slightly different vision. He wanted complete control over every element of every frame. He wanted to be able to tweak performances in post-production. He wanted actors performing against blue screens so he could build the entire world digitally. Here's the thing though, The Phantom Menace actually used extensive practical effects, alongside its groundbreaking CGI, miniatures, pyrotechnics, practical vehicles, explosive sequences were filmed on real sets. But Lucas was pioneering ILM's digital capabilities in a way that showed studios that it was possible, even if it hadn't fully been abandoned from practical work. Ewan McGregor later talked about how disorienting it became as the prequels progressed, with more and more blue screens replacing practical sets, and by Revenge of the Sith, the ratio had tipped heavily toward digital environments. He described acting against nothing as being told to imagine there's a giant battle happening to your left while staring at a blue wall. It just doesn't help the actors act any better, but yes, it does help the studios and people being able to generate everything they would want, but that doesn't help the actors. And who sells the movie? The actors. Okay, but the prequels made money, and yes, they made huge money. But that sent a signal to every studio in Hollywood that the digital flexibility was the future of movies. It was cheaper, it was faster, and infinitely more controllable than building real sets and hiring armies of craftspeople to create practical environments. The thing I think people miss the most is that CGI became dominant not because it was better at first, but because it was more controllable and cost-effective. Building that Jurassic Park T-Rex took months and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. If something broke during filming, you had to stop everything and fix it. If the director wanted to change the creature design, tough luck, it's literally already built. It's a giant fucking T-Rex. A digital T-Rex though, you can animate in weeks, you can change its size, color, behavior with simply a few clicks. Now, that's oversimplifying it. Obviously, it would take weeks to redesign it, but not months to redesign it. You could shoot the scene with the actors first, then add the dinosaur in later, and if there were any mistakes in post, you could just test multiple versions of the same dinosaur, and the director can come into the writing room later and tweak things in the script, and then you can tweak things in the shots months after the filming was even wrapped. For studios, this was paradise, but for the act of filmmaking, not so much. But there's also moments in CGI where even though it is advanced, it still doesn't look good, like Black Adam with Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, where he literally looks like he's getting birthed out of the sky. Or when they try to remove Superman's mustache because Henry Cavill was filming a separate movie and so they had to CGI his mustache out and everyone could tell they were doing it. Superhero movies just traditionally get a bad rap for getting a lot of VFX in scenes for unnecessary reasons. Like in Ant-Man and the Wasp when they had MODOK, that could be an entire separate video, but they literally chose to put a large man in a small stuffed suit when they could have gone for a slightly animated look. Or they go too far in the animation department, like when they literally animated Ryan Reynolds' suit in Green Lantern to the point where it just looked like a floating head with a computer-generated body on him. Or even when the Flash looks like he was literally getting... actually, I would not really like to describe what he's actually looking like he's getting. But these are just honorable mentions about Hollywood when they do this thing where they overgenerate and think that more effects in every single scene equals a better movie. And they can just take practical effects and practically sweep them under the rug, being like, oh, that was old and outdated, and we do the new stuff now. When in actuality, that is one of the founded principles of what makes a great movie, being somewhat practical. But no one really wants to make a great movie from scratch nowadays. Hollywood then does over CGI on films and then wonders why critics are getting mad and then simply say, where did we go wrong? Like, why does this CGI Hulk look great, but this She-Hulk busting it down sexual style with Megan Thee Stallion as a lawyer look bad? Maybe because the CGI Hulk is overdone. But this isn't just a dog on She-Hulk. I mean, look at Bruce Banner in the Hulkbuster in Infinity War. It genuinely looks bad. His head is way too small for the actual suit. The list goes on, and you could practically do an entire video about overly done CGI in superhero movies, but I couldn't leave this part out as it is a quintessential pillar to the actual desire of when people wanted a lot more CGI, went too far over the edge, and now
it just kind of looks like slop. And practical movies are way more deemed as like the classics than CGI movies could have ever done.
However, there are exclusions to people who had the ability to make CGI effects in the late 2010s that chose practical, and it really worked in their favor. George Miller is either insane or a genius director, because when he made Mad Max Fury Road in 2015, deep into the CGI era, he deliberately chose practical effects for almost everything. Real explosions, real vehicles, real stunts with real humans, doing genuinely dangerous things at high speeds. The production used over 150 actual vehicles, and many of which were destroyed during filming. The war rig flip, the most difficult stunt in the entire movie, according to Miller, was achieved practically, with a semi-truck actually flipping over and over. The result? A movie that feels visceral in a way modern action films don't today, and you can feel the impact of every collision because your brain registers it as real. Obviously, CGI was used, sure, to remove safety cables, enhance backgrounds, and extra debris, but the foundation was always physical, so your brain, understanding it's real, the CGI counterparts that were added as extras also feel real because the foundation is real. If you have a real foundation but a balloon house, it's not going to feel that real. But if you have a real foundation and a real house, but the light switches are made out of like pumpkin bread, I mean, it's not going to be that big of a deal. Miller understood that limitations create art, as we mentioned. When you can't just fix it in post, you have to get creative. You have to problem solve. But you build practical solutions that end up looking a little more interesting than anything you could have ever rendered. But back to what I said earlier about practical effects, it doesn't make actors act any better. When you're Harrison Ford and you're actually dangling off a real miniature cliff being blown away by wind machines with actual dirt in your face, your performance has a certain quality. There's no acting required for the physical discomfort. You're literally living in it. And the audience can see it in your eyes, your body language, and even the way you move. Now, imagine you're standing on a green soundstage, being told to react to a creature that doesn't exist in an environment that you can't see during a battle that won't be added until 6 months from now in a VFX studio. You're not experiencing anything. You're forced to imagine it as much as you are forced to imagine emotion, which actors already have to do. Now, don't get me wrong, some actors can pull this off, but most can't. And even the ones who can, you can tell it's harder to do, and the audience picks up on it. You're emotionally more disconnected when you know that the entire movie was made on a set that wasn't real. The original Ghostbusters featured Slimer, which was a puppet performed by a guy in a foam latex suit that was definitely uncomfortable. It can only be worn for literally short periods because of how uncomfortable it was. Off camera, puppeteers controlled the facial expressions using rods and cables, and the library ghost transformation was achieved through optical printing with cross exposure. Amazing? They used special makeup on the actress that would become transparent during re-exposure and carefully controlled the lighting and added animation to obscure the transition points, which made it way more sophisticated than just a simple dissolve. Now look, the effects look dated now. Nobody's arguing that they're technically superior to modern CGI. That's not my case here. But watching Bill Murray's face when Slimer flies at him, he's reacting to an actual thing hurling toward his head. There's genuine surprise, there's an expression, because something unexpected just happened. Instead of a green screen guy in a suit running at him and he has to go, The 2016 Ghostbusters had more advanced CGI ghosts that could do anything the filmmakers imagined. But multiple critics and VFX professionals noted that the actual ghosts, even though they could be advanced and made in any way they wanted to, people said they looked too clean and too polished. In a world where you can have everything you want in CGI, people and critics who specialize in CGI are still looking at CGI and going, you did too good of a job. But they're right, they lack the grungy, tangible qualities of the original Ghostbusters and often original movies of that decade. Even when the rendering is technically flawless, there's something less convincing about perfection. There's also this aging problem that no one talks about, where practical effects age differently than CGI, and that sounds like a weakness, but it's actually revealing something really important about how we process images and movies when time passes. And when we look at CGI from 10 years ago, it often looks worse than practical effects from 40 years ago, because our brains have gotten so much better at detecting digital artifacts, we know what CGI looks like now, and so we can spot it once it's bad, but we can obviously still spot it once it's good. But when we spot something that is practical, it is often the after effect after we've watched a movie to understand that it's practical, and then we understand it. Usually when we're watching a movie, we automatically assume it's CGI, so we can already tell what was CGI and what was not. There's this weird paradox at the heart of modern VFX. The more technically perfect CGI becomes, the less believable it often feels. Blade Runner 2049 2049 is a masterpiece of digital effects at work. The team spent a year creating a CGI recreation of actress Sean Young to bring back the character Rachel. They used facial scanning, motion capture, digital skull remodeling, cutting-edge technology to create a photorealistic human performance. And it still looks off. Not bad, just slightly wrong. The kind of wrong that your brain picks up even though you can't articulate why it feels wrong. And the problem really comes into play with green screen versus practical sets. The space and director practically has to inform the actor how to do said performance, and then actors move differently because they don't really know what they're stepping on, what they're walking on, or what even they're moving towards. But back then, camera operators would respond to actual movement. Light behaves differently with physical people, and it's bouncing off real surfaces. They can actually frame a scene, and the actor can actually move through a scene more realistically. But green screen virtually removes all of that. You're filming people in an empty void, then painting everything around them later. And no matter how good your VFX team is, there always is this subtle disconnection where the lighting is slightly off, the eye lines don't quite match, and the actors aren't casting shadows actually correct. Films like The Mandalorian tried to solve this with the volume LED walls displaying real-time renderings of the scenery. And it definitely was an improvement, but it's also a tactic admission that green screen has fundamental problems that also need solving. So why not just go back to practical? There are some smart filmmakers though of today who have figured out the secret about CGI. Use it to enhance already good practical work, not replace it. And I don't know why it took this long for people to figure it out. Top Gun Maverick is basically a love letter to practical effects. Real planes, real stunts, real G-forces making actors' faces do that weird thing where it looks like the skin is trying to escape, and CGI is really used sparingly. To remove camera rigs, enhance backgrounds, add details, but the foundation, like I said, is always real. Dune built massive practical sets and shot on location in real deserts, then used CGI to extend the environments, add impossible architecture, and the actors were interacting with real sand, real sun, and real physical space. The digital elements grew from that reality rather than just replacing it. This is the path moving forward. Stop thinking of practical versus digital as an either or choice. Use whichever tool services the story in that moment and build off of it. Now look, this whole practical versus CGI debate isn't really about special effects to me. It's about a larger philosophical question. Why aren't movies practical anymore? Because it's easier not to be. CGI is faster. It's cheaper, and it's more flexible. It gives studios control and directors unlimited options. It gives the irrational choice from a business perspective. Classic. The art vision is dying and people just want to put money in their pockets. But rational choices don't always make better art. The shift from practical to digital represents both progress gained and progress lost. We gained infinite creative possibilities, but we lost something harder to quantify. A kind of visual authenticity, if you will. And audiences are obviously starting to notice. Maybe we'll find a balance, or maybe it'll be CGI all the way through, and we'll remember the good old days where you couldn't just render out anything, and things actually had to be made by a real human.